I stared at the laptop screen, blinking in disbelief, as if I couldn't quite believe that this letter really existed, that it was addressed to me and, most importantly, that it contained the names of my parents, people with whom I hadn't exchanged a word or even a sidelong glance for 10 years, a decade. Which flew by like a blink, but left a deep, stubborn crack in me, through which a barely perceptible but invariably bitter pain still oozed. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. In my mailbox, which I had almost forgotten the way to, the old school address, created once at my father's insistence, with a password he invented so that nothing would get lost, there suddenly turned out to be a letter, as if sent not just from the past, but from that parallel reality where the family was still something important. The letter began with a polite, careful address, "Dear Tessa," and this "dear" made me feel something between a chuckle and a smirk. Did they really think that after all these years this wording would make me feel warm? It read, "We are writing to inform you that in 2 weeks a family meeting will take place at your brother's newly purchased house." Just like that, dryly and neutrally, as if there wasn't a yawning gulf of resentment between us, silence that hadn't been spoken, as if all this was nothing more than a short break in regular tea parties. "All the closest relatives will be there, and we think you should come too," the letter continued, and I couldn't help but snort, exhaling, "It's the right thing to do." Classic mom and dad, they always knew what was right. They knew who should be helped and who should survive on their own, who should be a hero and who should be an extra in someone else's fairy tale. I closed my laptop with a click, as if this action could cut off all the absurdity of the situation, erase it from reality, then got up and went to the window of my office, high above the city, to a glass wall with a view of the streets, cars, lights, everything that I chose to forget. The headquarters of the restaurant empire, which I helped build from scratch, was located on the 20th floor of this building, and every square meter of this office was proof that I was able, persevered, and grew through the asphalt, not because of, but in spite of. I thought about it all day, letting my thoughts wander around the letter like wild animals around a campfire, until in the evening, tired of my own hesitation, I sat down at my laptop, opened a new letter and typed, "I'll be there." Without emotions, without explanations, without exclamation marks, it's just a fact. I leaned back in my chair, letting the memories flood in like a tide that has no mercy, no choice but to flood. I've always been the odd one out in my family. Not unnoticeable, no, it is superfluous. Alien. Unnecessary. Derek was a golden child, his radiance dazzled everyone around him, handsome, with his charming smile and eternal charisma, funny, witty, always in the center, a magnet for attention, an idol to worship. Literally everyone adored him, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers, each of them looked at him as a dream come true, as the pride of his family name, as the light in the window. Our parents, yes, they could build him a shrine right in the middle of the living room, light him up with candles, and sing hymns to him every night. And I was just Tessa the mouse, quiet, shy, clumsy, hiding in the shadows. I preferred books to people, silence to noise, observation to participation, and for this I received condescending, disappointed glances. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" my mother asked when I once again tried to disappear into a corner at regular family gatherings, where the air was heavy with laughter, conversations, and the feeling that you were not here for business. These gatherings were a real torture. Derek is in the center, playing guitar, the audience's favorite, getting applause for every note, and I'm a shadow in the corner, counting the minutes until my escape. "There's the black sheep," Aunt Linda whispered, not softly enough not to hear. "What a strange girl," Uncle Rob replied, shaking his head, as if my existence was a puzzle that no one wanted to solve. My cousins were ruthless too. As a child, they excluded me from their games, and they did it with demonstrative pleasure. "We don't need Tessa, she's boring," Zach declared, and his sister Amber added, "She never talks at all." Then I would crawl into a corner with a book, pretending that I didn't care, as if I really preferred to be alone. And inside me, something was slowly breaking, like bones bending under pressure but not cracking, yet. When Derek graduated from high school, the whole family, and there was no exaggeration in this, chipped in to pay for his college tuition. They held whole meetings, conferred, selected a university, discussed, consulted, and in every conversation the same delight sounded: Derek has entered a state university. Isn't that wonderful? We are all so proud of him. And I, standing in the shadows, listened to this, realizing that in their world my voice would never have such weight, that my achievements, if they happened, would not be of interest to anyone. When it was my turn to graduate, everything was different. Mom and Dad called me into the kitchen, set me down at the table. Their faces were serious, as if they were going to tell me about something tragic. "Tessa," Dad said, "we don't have any money for your college." Mom pursed her lips, as she always did when she was embarrassed, and added, "All our savings went to Derek's education. And then the most important thing, you need to find a job and support yourself." I wasn't surprised. I really wasn't expecting any help. But it still hurt. Especially the next day, when I woke up and realized that I could no longer pretend that I didn't see the difference between me and my brother. I got a job as a waitress at the local Sam's Diner restaurant, which was about a 10-minute walk from our house, and although I had no illusions about this job, thinking that it couldn't get any worse, I was mistaken, because worse means when you're not just standing with a tray in your hand. And you collect sticky napkins from the tables, and when you have to do it under the eyes of your own family, those who should have supported you, but instead they come to your department, sit down at a table and begin the performance. My cousin, Amber, with the contemptuous laugh of a teenager stuck in the eternal school of life, and her brother, Zach, who was especially diligent in his role, regularly appeared in my gym and, not caring if I could hear them, but rather because I could, they loudly exclaimed, "Look at loser Tessa," stretching the name as if it were a nickname, and adding, "It looks like that's all she's capable of," after which Amber theatrically sighed and giggled, as if this was the best joke of her life. Which she, apparently, was going to continue in the same spirit for the rest of her days. I was silent, lowering my eyes and pressing my fingers into the edge of the tray, because I knew that if I started talking, I would either snap or cry, and neither was acceptable to me. It was especially difficult one evening when they left me a 5-cent tip, 5 copper, ringing, almost mocking cents, and wrote it on the check with a flourish, as if they were trying not to let me miss it. "Can you help someone else?" And these words, although written in the hand of a stranger, for some reason resonated with the voices of my relatives, voices from childhood, who also always wanted me to be someone else, better, louder, brighter. Then, wiping the table and feeling everything inside shrink and hurt, I realized that I had had enough. That night, when I got home, I told my parents that I was quitting and was going to move to the other side of the city, because I couldn't stand it anymore, because it was unbearable to go on shift every day, knowing that they might come with condemnation and ridicule. I found a job at another restaurant that was far from my neighborhood, and by saying, "I'm going to rent an apartment with my colleagues," I expected, unconsciously, but still, some kind of sign from my parents, maybe an alarm, maybe an anxious question, but instead my mother even smiled, not the warm, maternal smile that I remembered only from photographs, but rather relieved, as if I was getting rid of the burden. And I said, "It's probably for the best," and Dad, without looking up from the newspaper, just nodded and muttered, "Honey, you're old enough to live on your own," and that was it. Without hugs, without asking to call, without even a hint that they would miss me. 2 days later, I packed all my things, some clothes, old books, dishes that were mine and mine alone, and packed them into 3 cardboard boxes, with which, staggering with fatigue and barely holding back tears, I left the house in which I grew up, but they didn't even fit, didn't help. They didn't say a word, just watched me walk down the path, carrying a grudge that burned brighter than any torch. By that time, Derek had already left for college, which my parents had dreamed of so much, and he probably felt great, confident in the support of his family and his undeniable importance. As I was coming down the porch, my mom called after me, with the same lazy intonation as asking if you've forgotten to turn off the stove. "Don't forget to tell us your new address," and I nodded, but of course I didn't tell them, and they didn't ask anymore, as if they didn't care. I didn't care at all. The apartment I moved into was cramped, with peeling walls and a kitchen the size of a wardrobe, and the three of us shared it, me, Jamie and Liz, two waitresses tired of life and at the same time surprisingly kind, understanding. Each of us paid a third of the rent, and that was all our meager salaries were enough for, but at least there weren't those who looked at you as a failure. The new restaurant was called Bella's, and it was run by a woman named Isabella Martinez. Strict but fair, she didn't suck up or pretend, she just saw people for who they were. This place did not claim to be prestigious, the food was simple but honest, and the atmosphere was working, and it was enough for me that no one knew my past, called me Tessa the Mouse, or compared me to my brother. I immersed myself in my work, arriving earlier than everyone else, leaving later, taking all the extra shifts I could, because, yes, I needed the money, but even more I needed the silence in my head so that I wouldn't hear any more voices from the past, neither Aunt Linda nor Uncle Rob, not even his own mother. 6 months later, I noticed that Isabella was watching me, not with suspicion, but with interest, and one evening, when I was finishing my shift, she beckoned me into her office. "Tessa, I'm impressed with your work ethic," she said, pointing to a chair in front of her, and I sat down, a little embarrassed, because this was the first time in my life that someone not only noticed my efforts, but also appreciated them. "You're the most reliable waiter I have," she continued, and I just mumbled, "Thank you," not used to hearing kind words addressed to him. Isabella leaned forward as if she was about to confide in me a secret. "I want to make you a head waitress. It's an increase of $150 and more responsibility," and my eyes widened. I was confused, but I exhaled, "Really?" "I mean, yes, thank you," and she smiled for the first time ever. "There's something else. Have you ever thought about running a restaurant?" she asked, and I shook my head, not even knowing how to respond to that. "There are courses at the community college. I think you have potential. I would agree to adjust your schedule to your studies if you are interested," and for the first time in many years I felt that someone believed in me, just like that, without conditions, and I was happy to say, "I'd love to." Thanks to the promotion and a small but steady increase, after a few months I was able to afford to move out from my neighbors and rent a tiny studio, my first separate apartment in my life. Yes, it was very small, a room with a kitchenette and a tiny bathroom, but it was mine, just mine, without neighbors, without family, without anyone to remind me who I should be. The holiday season was approaching, and although I convinced myself that I didn't care, that I was above it, that I had a job, plans, goals, and new dreams, yet somewhere deep inside, in the place where the girls still lived, waiting for approval, I was haunted by a lingering, nasty melancholy, and one evening, when the streets were already decorated with flashing garlands, Christmas music was playing in the cafe where I took my takeaway coffee, and one of the customers was talking about a family trip. I gave up. Despite my sound judgment, I called home on December 15th, trembling as if I was about to jump into icy water, and when I heard the long beeps, I was suddenly afraid that they wouldn't answer me at all, that everything had stopped completely a long time ago. But then the phone was picked up, and I gritted my teeth and said, "Hi, Mom, this is Tessa," to which she replied, as if I had called her about a missed dinner or a pie recipe, indifferently and absently said, "Oh, hi, honey," without asking any questions, as if I hadn't disappeared from their lives for 2 years, but had simply moved to a nearby neighborhood. "How are you?" "I'm fine. I was thinking about plans for Christmas. I thought maybe I could." I began, picking up the words like scattered pieces in a futile attempt to glue them together into something whole and convincing, but she interrupted me with cold haste. "This year we're spending Christmas at Aunt Karen's," and I realized that there would be no invitation, but all the same, as if out of old habit, out of some last hope, I asked, "May I join you?" With a voice barely above a whisper, and there was a pause, strained, dry, as if the air had suddenly turned to glass, and then she said something you won't forget even after 10 years. "Well, to be honest, Tessa, no one asked about you. I think it would be awkward if you showed up now," and at that moment, it was as if the sound in my head was turned off, and everything inside went quiet, not from pain, no, but from understanding, everything that had been died, and I hung up without saying a word, and then I cried, hiding my face in the pillow, until my throat began to hurt from restrained sobs, for an hour, maybe more, until fatigue set in, And then, wiping away my tears, I made a simple and final decision. I would no longer contact them. If they did not want me, then I would not waste my energy on to want them. The next day, when I came to work, with a face that I was trying to put in order, but my eyes betrayed a sleepless night, Isabella, with her attentive gaze, of course, noticed everything, but said nothing, just nodded towards the schedule and handed me a printout. Here's the last shift for Christmas Eve. And Christmas. Double pay, she added calmly, and I, no longer trying to pretend, nodded gratefully. Thank you. I have nowhere else to go. And then she looked at me with some kind of firm, confident sympathy and said simply, their loss. And in those 2 words there was more support than I've ever received from my own family. I threw myself into my work and studies, with a new determination, with the desire to prove, not to them, no, but to myself, that I was worth something, and the restaurant management courses became for me a window into another world, the existence of which I did not even suspect, because no one had ever told me before. That I might have a talent for numbers, for planning, for managing things, and even more so for leadership, but I discovered it like finding something long lost, hidden deep, but living inside all the time. By the time I turned 24, I was already the CEO of Bella's, and I had my own office, even if it was small, but it was mine, with a window and a coffee machine, with a schedule of meetings and a desk on which lay documents that required my decision, not someone else's instructions. And a salary that allowed me to move into a separate 1-bedroom apartment where everything belonged to me, the color of the walls, the smell of morning coffee, books on the shelf, and just when it seemed like I finally found a foothold, the day came that changed everything. Isabella called me into her office, and I immediately realized that something was wrong, because her face was tense and her voice was cautious when she said, "Your aunt died," and even though I barely remembered her, Aunt Karen was a figure in the background, distant, indifferent. Something stirred inside anyway, and then she added, "She left you some money. About $200,000, and it sounded like a mistake, like an accident." But Isabella continued, "I'm sorry you lost," and I shook my head and said, "We weren't close," and she just waved her hand as if to confirm, "It doesn't matter, now you have this money, and I do not know what to do with it." I waited, looking at her, feeling something new rise in me, excitement, idea, and then she said, "I was thinking about expanding. Open a 2nd location, maybe a 3rd. What do you think?" And I didn't hesitate for a second, as if this proposal already lived in me. "I think this is a great idea. I could help you make a business plan." This is what I studied, and that night I stayed up until 3 in the morning, sitting with my laptop, drawing diagrams, reading statistics, writing out competitors, forecasts, expenses, hiring staff, possible risks, location analysis, everything I knew and learned, I put into this plan how in my heart, and when I brought it to Isabella the next day, she flipped through the document, then looked at me, slowly raising her eyebrows. "This is a professional job, Tessa," and I just shrugged. Hiding my excitement, "This is what you deserve." 6 months later, we opened a 2nd restaurant, Bella's, on the other side of town, and 3 months later, a 3rd, in the very center, and both were successful from day one because everything was thought out to the smallest detail, and most importantly because we had a reputation earned through hard work. On my 26th birthday, Isabella invited me to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, and after dessert, as we sat laughing over something insignificant, she took an envelope out of her bag. "Happy birthday, Tessa," she said, and inside I found a legal document in which I was officially called a partner with 30% of shares in the Bella's restaurant group. I stared at her, speechless, hardly believing my eyes, and she smiled and said, "You deserve it. I couldn't have done it without you. And to be honest, I'm tired. I want to spend more time with my family. And you're young, ambitious, and you have a vision," and I, still not knowing what to say, could only exhale, "Yes. We're going to turn this into a restaurant empire," and laughed. A restaurant empire. I liked the sound of that. Over the next 4 years, which seemed to fly by like one long, infinitely intense, and at the same time surprisingly fast-paced moment, Isabella and I expanded the restaurant chain to 12 branches scattered throughout the state, and it was then that I became not just the managing director or executive director, but the real face of the entire company, bearing the responsibility for everything, from the development of new seasonal menus that reflected not only culinary fashion, but also our taste, to marketing campaigns, social media posts, and the media image of Bellis as a brand that has become synonymous with comfort, quality, and trust. Isabella laughed, calling herself half-retired at 52, and I had no doubt that this was not a joke, because more and more questions and decisions fell on my shoulders, and I gratefully accepted them, because the shy, awkward girl I once was had disappeared, leaving instead she saw herself as a confident, competent, successful businesswoman who knew her own worth and moved forward with a firmness she hadn't had before. I bought a luxury house in one of the most prestigious and picturesque areas of the city, a modern, spacious dwelling with high, almost airy ceilings and huge floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of the city skyline, especially in the evenings when the lights of the metropolis turned into a shimmering sea and the sky turned golden-pink shades. My car, an elegant dark blue Mercedes with a cream interior, perfectly suited my new lifestyle, and the bank account, in which the zeros after the numbers no longer fit into the usual pattern, reminded me daily how far I had come from the life where I had to save on breakfast and choose between tuition fees and rent. And yet, despite this success, despite everything that I achieved on my own, without anyone's support, one thing remained unchanged: my relationship with my family, or rather, their complete absence. For almost 10 years, there has been no call, no letter, not even a casual message. During all this time, they became as much strangers to me as random passers-by on the street, whose faces I didn't even remember. Therefore, when one cloudy weekday I discovered an email that had arrived at my old email address, the one that I had kept active only for the sake of old business contacts, I was truly stunned. The subject of the letter was concise: family reunion, Derek's house. I reread the letter 3 times, as if hoping that the meaning would change, that it was a mistake or a prank, but no, they invited me. And I was sitting in my home office, surrounded by silence and minimalist furniture, staring at the screen with this unexpected message from the past, wondering, why? Why am I even considering going after so many years of silence? What do I want? Recognition, reconciliation, and maybe even revenge. Or maybe I just wanted to see with my own eyes what I had once given up in order to finally make sure that I had made the right choice. The day of the reunion turned out to be unexpectedly clear, warm, with a soft spring sun, and everything about that day seemed to tease me with a reminder of how things could have been if things had turned out differently. I stood in front of the wardrobe, peering at my extensive selection of clothes, wondering how I should present myself to people I hadn't seen in almost a decade. I knew exactly what I didn't want. I didn't want to be too smart, too expensive, too successful for show. I didn't want my appearance to scream about how well I was doing. It would be too obvious, almost pathetic, like a plea for recognition. In the end, I chose something that reflected my essence: dark, immaculately fitting jeans, a silk blouse in a calm shade, and a soft cashmere cardigan. The only concession to luxury was my watch, which was thin and almost weightless, but it cost more than I was sure Derek earned in a couple of months. I looked at myself in the mirror: slender figure, smooth bob, clear cheekbones, straight posture, firm gaze. At 30, I didn't look at all like the Tessa who used to leave this house with her eyes swollen from crying. I was no longer a bullied child. I was a woman with an empire behind her. Instead of driving my own Mercedes, I called a taxi, which was also a deliberate gesture. I didn't show my status. I came as a guest, as an adult daughter, not as a triumphant one. The trip to the neighborhood where Derek now lived took about half an hour, and all the while I was rehearsing possible dialogues, coming up with answers, calculating reactions, like in business, where every phrase can have consequences. I've decided, I will remain calm, no matter what the meeting is. The house turned out to be the most ordinary suburban 2-story house in an area that had clearly lost its former luster. Nothing special. You can't even call him old, just tired. I noted without complacency that my house was twice as big and 10 times more sophisticated, but I immediately dismissed this thought. I came not to compare, but to close the gestalt. I rang the doorbell. Laughter, the sound of voices, and the clatter of dishes could be heard from inside. A few seconds later, the door opened and she appeared on the threshold, my mother, in an apron, with a serving spoon in her hand. She froze in place, looking at me with an expression of such genuine confusion that I almost wished I hadn't come. 5 long seconds, and suddenly, "Tessa, is that you?" "Hi, Mom," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She blinked, then said, "Oh my God, look at you." There was genuine surprise in her voice, as if she expected to see me in a cheap waitress uniform, with disheveled hair and a tired face. Come in, everything is already here," she added and stepped back, letting me go inside. I entered the house, and I was immediately overwhelmed by the familiar cacophony of the family gathering, the hum of voices, the clink of dishes, the discordant chorus of laughter, interrupting each other's remarks, rustles, creaks and footsteps, the painfully familiar but long-forgotten rhythm in which I had previously existed as an insignificant note in the orchestra, the conductor of which always there was Derek. The living room and dining room were filled with relatives, aunts with their invariable, fluffy cascade hairstyle, uncles in short-sleeved shirts, cousins who grew up to be bulky, angular men, and their children, who seemed to have inherited the same family loudness and tendency to disorder. My father, already with gray at the temples and a kind of devastated look, was talking to Uncle Rob by the fireplace, and their conversation sounded somehow mechanical, as if memorized phrases were repeated out of politeness, not out of interest. Derek, as expected, was holding court in the center of the room, gesturing with a beer in his hand, leaning on the back of the couch with the air of a confident monarch, while the group of cousins surrounding him were choking with laughter, reacting to his every remark as if they were being paid for the volume. When I entered, the conversation stopped, and this moment, silence filled with the electricity of recognition, stretched out in my perception like a pause before a storm. Heads turned, eyes widened, and I felt dozens of stares on me, surprised, appraising, hostile, curious. "Is that little Tessa?" someone muttered, perhaps Aunt Linda Stage. Her voice I would have recognized even centuries later. Or maybe it was another of my many relatives. It doesn't matter. The point was surprise, that I appeared, and how I am now she looked. "She looks different," someone whispered, and another voice, a little louder, muttered something unintelligible, but not very friendly in intonation. I nodded politely to everyone, making no attempt to rush into anyone's arms or start greeting each other in turn. I allowed them to come up to me if they saw fit, not because I wanted to play hard to get, but because I was no longer the Tessa who was always apologizing for her existence. I noticed my cousin Amber, now as grown up as I am, leaning over to her husband and whispering something, and although I averted my eyes so as not to show what I had heard, I clearly caught the words waitress and narcissist. Cute, really, how they still relived in a fantasy about my worthlessness, as if the past had not passed. I pretended I hadn't heard, but I smiled inwardly. It was funny to see how they were still clinging to the old story where I was a loser, an ever-complaining waitress, the irony of which was that I was probably the only one present who had truly chosen my life and become who I wanted to be. Become. "Tessa is here," my mother suddenly announced, loudly, as if she wanted to make sure I wouldn't disappear if she said it confidently enough. "Isn't that wonderful? The whole family is back together," she added, not so much addressing me as others, trying to register my presence as a sign of family triumph. My father came up, looking older, slightly bent, and awkwardly hugged me from the side. His touch was careful, as if he was afraid of getting burned by my new life. "It's good to see you, baby. It's been too long," he said, and with a restrained smile, I replied, "Yes, it was," without specifying that the phone works both ways, and none of them bothered to take advantage of this knowledge. And then, like in a movie where the main character appears at the right moment, Derek finally noticed me and sauntered over, without losing a grain of his usual importance, remaining the center of attention even when he crossed the room, and his approach felt like an impending storm. "Well," he said, giving me an exaggerated quick glance with mock irony, "if it's not my little sister who's finally decided that family is good enough for her again." "Hi, Derek," I replied calmly, looking straight into his eyes, without fear, without challenge, but with dignity. "Congratulations on the house." He seemed stunned by my restraint, but he quickly came to his senses, snorting slightly. "Thank you, this is just an initial house. You know, I plan to renovate it in a year or two, when the business really takes off." We all moved into the dining room, where there was a long table, not quite the right size for everyone, covered with dissimilar plates, some from a set, another clearly from IKEA, the third with chipped edges, and appliances that seemed to have been hastily assembled from all the kitchen drawers. Derek, of course, took a seat at the head of the table, with our parents on either side of him, and I was directed to the very end, next to my second cousin, whose name I could hardly remember, and opposite the child, who, completely ignoring me, busily kicked the table leg, as if he was doing an important job. The mission. The meal began with toasts, and of course, they were all addressed to Derek. My father stood up first, raising his glass and saying with an expression in his voice that was supposed to convey pride, "To my son, who made us so proud, from the star quarterback in high school to the successful businessman he is today. Derek has never disappointed us." The hall was filled with applause. My mother followed. "Derek has always been special," she said with a twinkle in her eyes, as if not noticing how the other children in the family disappear against the background of this radiance. "His auto parts business is booming, and now this beautiful house is something we couldn't be more proud of." More applause. Uncle Rob also stood up. "I remember when Derek was still a little boy. He already showed leadership qualities that made him successful. He does honor to this family." The toasts continued, one after the other, each more enthusiastic than the last, and Derek soaked them up like a dry sponge, straightening his shoulders with each word, puffing out his chest, as if medal after medal was hanging around his neck. And at some point, he must have remembered that I was here too, because he looked at me across the table with a slight, lazy grin. "And you, Tessa," he said, as if pulling a thread of attention to himself, "do you want to say something?" All heads turned to me. I put down my fork, ready to just congratulate him, maybe even pay tribute, not to him, but to the situation itself, but he didn't let me finish. "Are you still waiting tables, sis, or have you already been promoted to dishwasher?" I saw him blink a little more often than usual, as if trying to banish an illusion in which I suddenly stopped being a quiet loser who had once left home without a specific plan, and now returned with a card that silenced everyone at this table. My mother continued to smile, but her fingers fiddled with the edge of the napkin in her lap, a habit I remembered from childhood. She did this when she was nervous, but did not want to be noticed. "It's just unbelievable," Aunt Linda said, tilting her head to one side with feigned admiration. "I never imagined." "And we thought you were somewhere in a small cafe. You didn't think," I replied calmly, looking directly at her. "You just decided that you knew everything and didn't consider it necessary to check." Someone coughed in the far corner, and the tablecloth trembled slightly from the movement under the table as the child continued to kick, but no one pulled him back. Everyone was busy with me. "But why didn't you call us?" Amber finally couldn't stand it. Her face was a little red, and her voice was trembling treacherously, perhaps from irritation, perhaps from confusion. I leaned back in my chair, crossed my arms over my chest, and gave her a strange shrug. "I called once. You then handed the phone to your husband, and he said that you were busy. Since then, I've decided that maybe they just don't really need me." A crease twitched at the corner of Amber's lips, but she didn't say anything else, leaned back and looked away. Derek finally straightened up, as if he had shaken off his stupor, looked at the card he was still holding in his hand, and said with feigned lightness, "Well, that sounds impressive. Apparently, being a waitress isn't such a bad thing if things have turned out this way, is it?" His voice was a little louder than it needed to be, and there was tension behind his smile. "Starting from the bottom is not a disgrace, but an honor," I said, not raising my voice, but also not hiding the confidence that was now felt in every cell of my body. "The problem is not where you start, but how quickly others rush to write you down as a loser. And how much they're surprised when you don't live up to their expectations." My voice was even, calm, almost matter-of-fact, but I could see how those sitting around me hung on every word, as if it were a lesson they suddenly understood but were too shy to admit. "How many employees do you have?" Someone asked from the far corner. I didn't see who exactly, but I heard sincere interest. About 400. This includes the kitchen, service staff, office department, marketing, and menu development department. We have a team that deals only with analytics. We calculate every step, every opening point. Everything is under control. Are you participating in one of those cooking shows? The voice was Linda's again, but now there was less arrogance in it, and more confused curiosity. No, I'm not a cook, I grinned. We have an executive chef who used to work in New York. I am a manager. I am responsible for strategy, partnerships, financing, and legal aspects. But when it's necessary, I know how to make risotto and close the shift without failures. It's just not necessary for a long time. There was silence at the table again, not the awkward, oppressive one, but another, respectful one, filled with the realization that the person they had all forgotten had returned not as a guest, but as someone who could no longer be ignored. I noticed my father shaking his head, looking at the card, then at me, then back at the card, as if trying to put together the image of an adult woman in front of him with that girl who once said she wanted to leave and try it on her own. You're a co-owner, he repeated, as if he were saying it out loud to believe, and you. Are you in control of all this? I nodded, restrained, not wanting to turn it into a triumph, but also not wanting to belittle the importance. Yeah. I'm in control. And although he did not utter a single compliment, did not raise a toast, did not make the slightest gesture of recognition, the way he lowered the card, the way he sat a little straighter, was what I had been waiting for many years, recognition, even if tacit. Derek was still sitting there, as if cut off from the rest of the table, his shoulders slightly slumped, his chin tense. The center of attention, accustomed to the applause, found itself in the shadows for the first time. I saw him chewing on the inside of his cheek, a childish habit that betrayed his embarrassment. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't find the words. And in that pause, in that silence, I felt everything inside me finally fall into place. I heard her fall silent on the other end of the line, and in that pause full of tension and unspoken words, I suddenly felt something heavy, almost physical, rise in my throat, as if an old grudge that had lain for so long under layers of indifference suddenly burst out, demanding to be voiced. I heard her take a breath, as if she was going to say something important, maybe explain, maybe justify herself, but then she just exhaled and said in a barely audible voice, I didn't know how. And at that moment it became clear to me that for all these years she really didn't know, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. Because it was easier to live pretending that I didn't exist. I was silent. There was an urgent note in her voice. We just want you to come. Just let's talk. Everything will be different. I nodded stiffly, even though she couldn't see it, of course. I'll think about it, I said, and without waiting for an answer, I hung up. For the rest of the day, I walked around the house, opening and closing windows, making coffee, then not drinking it, turning on music, then turning it off, but my thoughts kept returning to the conversation, as if two voices were arguing inside me, one tired and disappointed, demanding to keep his distance, the other, which is still he kept a faint hope that at least something could be fixed, he asked to give them a chance. In the evening, I sat on the sofa with a glass of red and stared out the window, where the city lived its life, indifferent, bright, pulsating evenly, as always. I didn't want to go back to that living room, to that table where I had once been humiliated by snide laughter, and where now, suddenly, chairs had been hastily set up to reconnect. But there was a part of me that wanted to say everything that had been accumulating for so long, not for them, but for myself. When Sunday came, I still hadn't made a final decision, and it wasn't until the last moment, already standing at the wardrobe and looking at my reflection, that I realized I was on my way. Not because I believed they had changed, but because I needed to see it. I needed to make sure that I really wasn't who they thought I was anymore. I chose a strict, dark suit, not out of a show of power, but as an armor capable of keeping my distance. On the way, I looked out the window, and the streets were almost empty, as if the city had left this time only for me so that I could be alone with myself and my thoughts. When I arrived, I didn't get out right away, gave myself a minute, then took a deep breath, pulled my hair back into a ponytail, picked up my purse and climbed the familiar steps, which suddenly seemed strange. My mother opened the door. She looked a little confused, as if she hadn't expected me to actually come. "Tessa," she said with some trepidation, but I just nodded. The house smelled of roast meat and vanilla, too diligently, too ostentatiously, as if they were trying to compensate for years of silence in this fragrance. My father was standing a little to the side, by the window, and when he saw me, he came closer. His face was restrained, but there was something like relief in his eyes. "Glad to see you," he said. I nodded again. Derek was already sitting at the dining table. He didn't get up, just looked over his shoulder and muttered, "Hello." He avoided my gaze. We sat down. My mother poured the wine, my father poured the water. Everyone was talking a little quieter than usual and trying to be as friendly as possible, but there was a tension in the air that couldn't be erased even by the most polite remarks. My father broke the silence first. "Tess, we really want to fix this. We understand that a lot has been said and done incorrectly." I put down my fork and looked at him. "You didn't just say something offensive. You crossed me out. For Christmas. On my birthday. When I moved in. When I first signed the contract for the restaurant. Where have you been?" The mother clutched the napkin in her hand. "I didn't know you felt that way." "No," I interrupted her, "you knew. It was just more convenient for you not to think about it." The silence became dense, as if the air had thickened between us. I really don't know why I did that back then," she said, and there was real weariness in her voice. "Probably because it hurt me, to see you leave as if you don't need us." "But you weren't," I replied quietly but firmly. "You've never asked me how I am. They never wrote. They didn't come. And now that you've found out that I've achieved something, you've decided that I'm yours again." My father closed his eyes, as if those words had hurt him. "It's not like that. We want you back." "I haven't disappeared anywhere," I said, getting up. "You just weren't looking. I left before dessert." This time, no one followed me to the door. I walked down the darkening street and felt light, not because I was feeling better, but because I knew now that I didn't owe anyone anything anymore. There was a pause, a long, heavy one, filled with the tension that accumulates over years of silence, false hopes and unexpressed feelings, and suddenly, as if under the pressure of unbearable internal pressure, she tore off her sweet, strained, almost theatrical mask, behind which she so diligently hid confusion and resentment, and with a sharpness in her voice that could be heard she said, "How can you be so ungrateful?" And at that moment her voice trembled not from weakness, but from anger. Accumulated, perhaps, no less than mine, but directed not inward, like mine, but outward, as always. "Ungrateful?" I asked with a cold, almost scientific detachment, as if I were studying something alien, as if I were trying to make out this word in detail in order to understand on what basis it could be addressed to me, and added, no longer hiding either irony or pain, "Do you really want to talk about gratitude? Broken man, after all that you supposedly did for me? What exactly did you do for me?" And without giving her a chance to open her mouth, without letting a direct answer escape, I continued, listing them cautiously, point by point, as in the report. "You didn't pay for my education. I took out loans, worked nights, you didn't support my career, you didn't even understand what I was doing, you didn't call to check if I was alive. When I was sick, when it was difficult for me, you just disappeared." She tried to say something, but I interrupted her, as one interrupts a toast that is no longer appropriate. "You raised me, yes, but then you decided that I was no longer worth your time, your efforts, your attention. And now they suddenly decided that I was standing again. But it's too late." And without waiting for her answer, which would certainly have been weak, confusing, or exculpatory, I just hung up the phone, and at the same moment I felt something heavy, cold, and oppressive for many years suddenly disappear, as if a blanket of gray lead had fallen from my shoulders. Derek was next. His messages became more and more intrusive, anxious, filled with thinly disguised despair, at first neutral. "How are you?" Then surprised and reproachful dash, "Why don't you answer?" Then without cover, a long message, divided into paragraphs, asking for a business loan. "I only need $50,000. I'll pay you back, of course, with interest. It's just that it's a difficult period right now, you know." As if nothing had happened, as if 10 years of silence and indifference have no weight, as if our connections are still obliged to work according to the old rules. I waited until he got no reply, then sent another one. "Did you get my message?" and replied with a single word, "No." Then I immediately blocked his number. It's been about 2 weeks since that evening when I allowed myself to enter that house to leave it forever, and curiosity, which is hard to argue with, got the better of me. I opened Derek's page on social media and saw a long, plaintive post full of subtle jabs and loud statements. He wrote about family ties that mean nothing to some, about people who have forgotten where they come from, and how success can turn your head, turning good, humble family members into cold, ungrateful egoists. The comments under the post were like chorals singing. Aunts, cousins, distant relatives who never called or wrote to me, suddenly all rallied around poor Derek, comforting him with love, accusing me of arrogance, ingratitude, that I had become too big for my family. It should have hurt me, offended me, hurt me, but instead I laughed again, really, easily, sincerely, with that liberated laugh that comes when you realize that you really came out of the circle in which you were held not by them, but by yourself. They haven't changed at all. They're still the same, judgmental, narrow-minded, unable to look beyond their own resentment. The only thing that had changed was me, and now I saw them for who they were, without illusions, without a desperate desire to earn approval. I closed the browser and turned to the document on my desk, a proposal that Isabella and I had been working on for months. We planned to open a culinary school next to our flagship restaurant, not just as a business, but as a space where we could transfer knowledge, support new chefs and managers, giving something back to society, not out of duty, but at the behest of our hearts. When I looked through the calculations, analyzing profitability, I felt not only satisfaction from the business, but also a deep, complete confidence that my life belongs to me, that it was created by my hands, built step by step, without the support of those who should have been my rear, but became someone else's wall. The next day, when I was about to meet with investors, my assistant stopped me at the exit. "Your mother called the office 3 times, he said, a little doubtfully. "Should I continue receiving messages or block the number?" I froze for a moment, assessing not the weight of the calls, but my reaction to them, and realized that I no longer wanted to hear these names in my environment. "Block it," I replied calmly. "And all the other family-related numbers. I'm focused on the future, not the past." He nodded without asking any questions, and I entered the boardroom, feeling the lightness that comes when you finally let go of what has held you in chains for so long. This reunion did not give me what they wanted, not forgiveness, not togetherness, not a new attempt, but something much more valuable, permission. I no longer had to wonder if my departure was the right thing to do. I no longer had to wonder if they had changed or needed me. They showed me who they were, and I showed myself who I had become. I've become strong enough to see the toxicity, brave enough to set boundaries, and wise enough to know that some doors need to be closed not with regret, but with gratitude. Forever.